Yikes.
I know. I'm just like.
It's so icy. You look pretty clear though, so it's not my eyes.
It's a little. It just looks like. Yeah.
I can read it.
She I was like a sleeper, and she saw on Facebook, and so she bought 2 of them, and I woke up, and she was like, oh, she's like, guess what I just got?
So, greetings. Welcome back. Did you go? No. Welcome back. The quiz question, which I think should be really interesting, actually, I find it interesting, is, remember last quiz, was, should value statements be considered non-cognitive or neither true nor false? I know growing up, I was absolutely convinced that there were an awful lot of value statements that were absolutely true. What parents told me, what the priest told me, what the church said. Granted, you find out, from other people that a lot of people disagree with you, and you think, well, they're just wrong, right? They're either uneducated, uncultured, whatever, they're wrong, right? But you come to higher education, and you end up discovering that scientifically, none of these statements can be demonstrated as either true or false. They're interpretive stances that you're taking based on your particular perspective from your experience. But as you broaden your experience and you discover that other people see things differently than you have to recognize that, well, gee, I think that this is true, but they think that the opposite is true. They like eating people, so they're cannibals, but that's their value. Sorry, that's a really rotten choice to pick. I remember reading once Albert Schweitzer was in, and did I mention Albert Schweitzer? He was in Africa during World War I. And Albert Schweitzer had been trained to be a minister, but he was from Alsace-Lorraine. He was officially German. So when he wanted to go to the French Congo to be a minister, the French wouldn't allow it because it was German, not French. He had to be a French minister. He couldn't be a German minister. So he went back to school for 2 years and got his MD. It only took 2 years back then to become a medical doctor. And so he went to the Congo, to the French Congo, as a doctor, as a missionary. And while there, World War I broke out, and in fact he was even in prison, so to speak, because he was a German citizen. But the clinic was moved into his prison because he was still the doctor, so all of his patients came in. And the one day he was sitting there reading the newspaper with the chief from the village, and he was reading the statistics on how many people had died in one of the battles. The trench warfare and the battles, thousands of men, like 24,000 men in one day or something. The chief looked at him absolutely astounded and said, how could you possibly eat that many people? Because in his culture at the time, they were cannibals. If you killed an enemy, you were socially obligated to eat that person to save his soul. And you can imagine, that actually would have worked out really well in World War I, where, if they had killed people, they had to stop the battle and eat everyone that they had killed. That would, nowhere near as many people would have died in World War I, right? So you imagine, cannibalism could have actually worked out to the good had we been cannibals in Europe at the time. I wasn't there. Right? But so you enter into this educational world, and there's so many different points of view. Of course, this is a real lively issue. I mean, you've got Europe, of course, kind of trying to be a melting pot, open borders, open everything. At least for all fellow Europeans. But of course, the outer borders weren't closed, and so they've got what, 1 million migrants that have moved in from cultures that are totally different. And of course, they're faced with a dilemma, you know. We want to remain European. That means we have to be multicultural, respectful for other people, and so on. And yet, many of the people that have moved in feel absolutely horrified by the cultural activities associated with modern life, and literally are attacking it in many different ways, right? I mean, we saw that just New Year's Eve this year with all the things that went on in Köln. Over 600 people were sexually harassed, women were sexually harassed by groups of men and so on. In fact, it seems like it's actually even a game that's played in some places, and that the men that brought that cultural game from their culture into Europe were just playing the game that was typical in their culture. So it becomes a real issue for us. How on earth do you feel about letting someone else live right in your community, but believing totally different values?
That's America.
Pardon?
That's the definition of America.
But isn't there supposed to be some sort of limitation? I mean,
Yeah, it should be. But
well, yeah, there should be, but how do we explain how that is? I mean, if we think about value judgments as non-scientific, so neither true nor false, they're your point of view, to what extent should we allow different groups of individuals insist that their point of view, their moral point of view, dominate the way the society behaves?
until it start having a negative impact,
Pardon?
or I said until it start having a negative impact, or people start getting hurt.
Well, for some people, that's immediately. I mean, if my daughters, either of them, dressed the way either of them normally dress, were to walk down, say, the street in Anchorage, even with me, right, would not make a difference for some people. They're totally immoral in the way they dress. And yet I wouldn't think that at all. And in fact, they're completely covered, but they're wearing pants. Both of them wear pants. I can't recall the last time I've seen you. Well, we went to a funeral. One of my daughters wore a skirt, right? But they wear pants. But pants are considered totally inappropriate for a woman in some cultures, right? You know, in some cultures, you'd be stoned for the way you're dressed right here in class, not the males. That seems totally unfair, doesn't it? You would be stoned. Absolutely. I can see your face. Can you imagine? Saudi Arabia just announced that it is now immoral for you to play chess in Saudi Arabia.
Too much thinking.
Well, the Imam argues that. It's also immoral for you to play music. That seems horrific. I wouldn't want to go any place where symphony orchestras were not allowed and encouraged, and children in schools were encouraged to pick up an instrument and learn how to play, participate in school band. Even, you know, when you go to those and the kids are all playing, it's like, oh. Have you ever gone to the Sonic Boom? Oh my goodness, you know, you need earplugs or you will not come out of there alive, you know, or at least not with your hearing still intact, you know, but you have to go there and like applaud and wave to your children and tell them, attack that trumpet. Yeah. And it's part of a good education is learning music, right? So how do we deal with this? Because if you think about it, this is this is our contemporary culture, saying that science cannot support saying that your moral values are true or false. And science is the only way to know anything for true, as true or false. So you can't how do you impose your vote? I love saying that when you have, say, a cultural group that has a set of values. So if we think of this as like a set of networked cognitive values that a group of people believe, right? And then you have another group that believe another set of values. Another group believes another.
So Republicans, Democrats, and Independents.
How many different cultural groups do we have in Anchorage? 110, something like that? How many do we have? So imagine all these different groups, and then if you think about it, law basically tries to establish that, I don't know if you can see this very well. My goal was to make it look like a flower, right? So these are all the different petals, right? But the only legal, now, have you ever heard the expression that you cannot legislate morality? Have you ever heard that? You cannot legislate morality. What does that mean?
Government can't decide what's moral.
Yeah, government, but it does though. I mean, that is what legislation is. So that can't really be the whole. I mean, so I have a friend, brilliant colleague, much smarter than me, refuses to wear seatbelts in the car. He's absolutely convinced that if he were in an accident, not wearing a seatbelt is what could save his life, because he'd be able to get out or something.
He is going to be able to get out.
Right? But of course, we as a society have legislated that if you're driving your car, you must be wearing a seatbelt, or you could get a ticket to enforce this, right? So in a sense, so to some extent, do you think of like the law that you come to a full stop at a stop sign, which is really hard to do? You ever come to a really full stop at a stop sign? Isn't it really hard? That's kind of funny because they're trying to make smart cars that could drive without the driver, a human being, right? The biggest problem they've come up with so far is that when these smart cars come up to an intersection and there's other people and they're all stopping at the stop signs, the smart car has been programmed not to start through the intersection until all other traffic has stopped. And so these cars actually get stuck there because no one else really comes to a full stop. So every time it's about ready to go, someone else goes. And so the person sitting in the car waiting to get someplace in the smart car will not be able to ever leave the intersection until there's like no cars there at all, which at a busy intersection, of course, it might not happen, right? But it's the law that you stop at a stop sign. Now, is that moral? Would you call that law moral?
No.
Break that law by not stopping fully at the stop sign? Are you being immoral?
No. Do it every day.
No, we don't think of that as immoral, right? So would you say that there's like certain things that are wrong behaviors that are not necessarily immoral? They're just
Unethical.
Or improper etiquette?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you go and you set the table for guests and you put the fork and knife on the wrong side, are you being immoral? That's almost frivolous, right? You might not even set knives and forks at the table, right? Until they ask for one. Can I have a fork? Does it have to be clean? No, okay, Wait a minute. There. I'll get that. There you go, it's nice and clean now. No, I'm kidding, you know, obviously. I'm trying to joke because, you know, I want you to laugh and stay awake. But this is serious, because actually there's an awful lot of things that we don't think are moral or immoral, maybe even legislated, like stopping at stop signs. Now, of course, if you went through a stop sign and ended up killing somebody, that was immoral. But most of the time that you don't really stop at the stop sign, you do the California roll, which is the name of a restaurant, right? It's not considered immoral, just wrong. So we might say that there's certain marks of the moral that, in order for it to be moral, you have to break more than one or two of them. You know, I've looked for this before, and I don't think I've been able to find it for years. It used to be a pretty good article, but that's obviously not what I was looking for. No, but if we say like there's not working. So if there's like different characteristics, they must be significant. For example, you know, where you put forks and knives at the table, it's not a significant issue. So for it to be a moral issue, it has to be significant. Does it have to harm other people for it to be a moral issue? About having sex before you're married. And I remember telling my youngest daughter, please don't get me in trouble with her. I know I shouldn't talk about this story, but when she was 11, I remember sitting in the car and she started talking about dating. No dating until you're 16 and no sex until you're married. My 11-year-old daughter looked at me and said, "Oh, Dad, that's not how it's done today." How do you raise daughters in this kind of society? I mean, this is, the era of Miley Cyrus, wiggling her butt cheeks, and Wrecking Ball. I mean, if you've seen her swinging on the Wrecking Ball. I confess, I have watched that more than once, just out of curiosity to try to figure why. That was so interesting. So marks of the moral should be like lots of different things, and so something isn't really completely moral unless it kind of meets certain criteria, right? So other things are just etiquette, faux pas, things that we wouldn't necessarily consider moral. So there are some things that the legislature makes law that we might not necessarily think of as moral, but for the most part, they are trying to legislate morality. This is the minimum behavior, that center overlapping consensus among all the different social groups that these things ought to be considered immoral for you to do. Letting your dog run loose in a park. There's children, other dogs. I mean, when we hear about, a big dog, that, eats somebody else's dog on a leash, basically kills it, don't we think that that behavior on the part of that dog owner was immoral? Even though it didn't harm a person, it harmed the person's feelings because they lost the dog that they thought highly of, etc. So the legislator is trying to legislate morality. I think the reason we say you cannot legislate morality is because if you don't agree with it, the law isn't going to make you do it. like my friend, who doesn't believe that seatbelts are really safe. So even though it's the law, he drives without seatbelts. So he's ignoring, I mean, the legislature is trying to make that a moral claim, really. But you cannot legislate morality. You can't successfully transform a society by saying, okay, from now on, no smoking. Right? You're not going to stop people from smoking. No taking cocaine. You obviously haven't stopped that, and so on.
I'm trying to figure out how it's getting here.
How
Is it getting here? I mean,
how
that's
cocaine is getting here?
yes, I'm talking about.
CIA?
I don't know. I'm asking.
I don't know, actually.
I'm trying to figure out how it
I imagine it's
find its
getting
way.
here like everything else gets here, because
In the
nothing
heart of the ghetto.
is manufactured here except, I guess,
Weed?
ulu knives. That's about it, I suppose. I mean, when I was in Nome once, I was in Nome for 6 weeks, and while I was there, I discovered that, of course, they have the gift shops there, where they primarily sell to tourists, of course. I mean, no one else, I think, in Nome is interested in buying stuff. Although I would hang out, looking around at the different gift shops, and I noticed, right? Have you ever seen Usiks? Know what an Usik is, right? Well, I saw Usiks, just plain white Usiks, and they were like $100. And I thought, that would be really neat. I could just see me giving my dad an Usik and asking him if he knew what it was. And
What
I
is
just
it?
pictured that whole scenario playing out. And so I thought, I would like an Usik.
What is it?
I would like an Usik. So I went to my friends who were working there with me. I said, if any of you see a local native selling an Usik, because the natives that would sell it on the street were much cheaper than the ones selling them in the gift shops. I said, go ahead and buy it for me. Like for about 25 bucks or something, that would be great. So the one evening, actually, I came back from work, and one of my friends, whose name was Tally, we always called him Tally, his last name was Wackert, Sergeant Wackert. He said, hey, Bill, aren't you interested in a Usik? Yes, I got one for you. It's under your bed. So I went into we were staying at the armory, and underneath my bed, sure enough, in a plastic bag was, and it was horrible, because it was raw. It had just come off of a walrus that had been on the beach, that had, they reported that a dead walrus had washed up on the beach. Sure enough, some natives harvested the various parts, but it was rotten. I mean, it wasn't like they could eat it or anything, but they did take off the ivory and so on. And they were selling the Usik, and he got it for $25. I said, you paid $25 for it? You didn't even dicker with the guy? So I ended up with an Usik. I gave him my $25, and I had an Usik, although it was still raw. And by the way, it smelled to high heaven. It smelled like a hippopotamus house.
What is an Uzi?
Oh.
I thought it was a knife.
It's a walrus dick.
Whoa.
Well, actually, it's not the whole thing. It's just the bone inside of the walrus dick.
Oh man, swinging.
Well, so mine was covered with bits of fat and stuff, and I thought, ugh. So I went back to the gift shops after I had, put it in another bag, tied it, put it in my fishing rod container so that it was as airtight as possible, because it was really foul. I went back to the gift shops and just sort of casually said, how do they get these like that? And he said, they just boil them, I suppose. So Sunday, I took the Usik, and I went to the store and I bought a turkey roasting pan and a pair of tongs, and I went down to the beach And I piled up some driftwood. There's no trees or anything in Nome, but they have driftwood that flows up from Bering Sea. I got some seawater, from the ocean, sat it on the fire, put the Usik in, and it actually didn't fit. I had to keep moving it back and forth in order to put it in the turkey roasting pan. And I boiled it for 4 hours. What was amazing to me was, because I was out there, I was in civilian clothes, right? So I just, dressed warm. It was September, so I was out there boiling this, and the Nome Nugget Inn bus stopped, and all of the tourists got out and lined up and took pictures of me. That was embarrassing. And so I boiled it, and after a while I gave up, and it wasn't really cleaned off completely, but I bagged it up, boxed it, and sent it to my wife without telling her what it was. And when she got the box, she didn't even open it or anything. She just put it out in the garage for me. And when I got home, I took it out and I hung it in one of those net bags under the eaves of the house in the backyard for a couple of years till it completely dried out. And now I keep it under the bed. So in case anyone breaks it, smack it under it. So we can make stuff like that here in Alaska. But everything else has to be imported, including cocaine, I'm sure. Because you have to grow it in like Afghanistan and jungles and places like that. Sorry about that story, but
Mexico.
so, by the way, if you stop by in like the gift shops downtown, they have some really fancy ones because they can carve them and do things with them. But it's not ivory, it's a bone. By the way, this is actually kind of interesting. There's an argument that the rib, you've heard Adam's rib, the story, right? In the Bible, one of the creation stories in Genesis, Adam and Eve are both created together. But in the other one, you've heard the story, I presume, that Adam was born first, and he was bored, so God created Eve by taking a bone from him. Yes? Okay. A lot of people say it's a rib, but actually, from what I understand, if you're translating the Hebrew, it's just called a bone. And it's considered to be an explanation for why it is that among all mammals, human males are the only mammals that do not have a penis bone. So the argument is that the bone that God removed from Adam to create Eve was actually his penis bone, not a rib. Honest to Pete, that's an argument that scholars have over the whole point of that story. It's not my fault. It's just true. You can look it up. You can look it up. Is that going to get me in trouble with anyone? Hopefully not. It's just true, that's all. And you can look it up. Double check, believe it or not. So, let's finish up chapter 2 and move on to chapter 3. By the way, if you feel like this issue has not been resolved, that's exactly the case. Because I don't think we are going to resolve this anytime soon. There are people, of course, that feel that certain values are absolutely true and others false. But there are others that basically continue to argue that any valuative statement is non-cognitive because you can't scientifically evaluate it. The interesting flip side to this, by the way, and I'll share this title with you. This is This is by Hilary Putnam, and it's called The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy, among other essays. What of course he means here is that the fact, science can tell you facts, these statements are true or false. Values, on the other hand, are neither true nor false, non-cognitive, etc. Right? So that's why science cannot deal with faith, right? And faith, well, you still have, doesn't necessarily go both ways, right? But so scientists can't dictate matters of faith and religion, etc. They can, of course, study religions and study faith in a social context, a sociology of religion and so on, but they can't dictate moral values because those cannot be evaluated apart from a contemporary meta-narrative that tells you how you should live, what the value of life is, what roles you should play, and what acts are good and which ones are evil. So within that kind of a social context, right, a story that you believe that's basically like the dogma of a church or something, you can have a scientific appreciation of true or false for these things. But here, what Hilary Putnam points out is that a contemporary analysis of what scientists think they're doing turns out to indicate that science is not value-free, but instead just the choices that scientists make on what to study is a valuative choice. The values associated with good science is a value-based institution. So to be a good scientist, you have to be consistent. Your conclusions have to be subject to evaluation by others, right? So if you come up with, say, a fusion machine, but no one else can make it, well, that's not good science, right? So that's not. So there are values that scientists have to have in order to be a good scientist, and just the sheer fact of what we're interested in, studying cancer, right? We want to cure cancer. Well, there's a value behind why you would want to study cancer and say not study something else because, well, I'll make more money if I solve cancer, right? If I solve the common cold, what's that going to do? Change the price of aspirin, right? Not going to be worth it to me, so I'm not going to go after, trying to solve the common cold or something, right? So there are values in science. So the collapse of the dichotomy is in the direction of saying that science isn't giving you facts either. So the situation's actually worse. We don't know what truth is in the big picture, right? So that's kind of interesting. That's the point of this book. Now, obviously, we're still going to do science. It's not going to stop the scientific enterprise and so on, but it enables us to reevaluate the difference between what we might call fact and value. So that comes from page 82, factual dispute. Of course, the book makes it look much simpler than that. Another aspect of this, though, is a verbal dispute. So, of course, sometimes when you're arguing with someone, you're using different words or you're using words differently than one another. You're simply misinterpreting one another. And so a logician in that case wouldn't be able to resolve the conflict between you because it's not really logic that's at problem, it's meaning, right? So the problem has to be resolved by first making sure that you're arguing about the same thing, right? Okay. So chapter 3, arguments. An informal way of, so
Who's stacked where they are right now in 1, 2, and 3 going into Iowa, and is that likely to change?
Yeah, I continue to think, and as viewers know, my predictions have been wrong consistently this entire year, but I think the big story out of Iowa will be that Trump underperformed. I do think he's got a turnout problem. I think that Sanders is going to underperform too because he relies so much on young voters, but maybe they're a little more mobilized to actually show up. Remember, going to the caucus is a multi-hour occupation. It's not just going to the voting booth and getting out of there. And so it takes a big time commitment, and an amazingly small percentage of Iowans actually do it. I think 1 in 6 or something like that. And so it's getting people out is the core thing. So I think Trump's the most likely story is that he will underperform, and we'll be talking about Cruz or somebody else.
EJ, is that how it stacks up for you?
So we have an argument. Right, this is happening today, right? Iowa's having their caucus today, polls apparently, but remember, polls don't really absolutely tell you the fact of the matter. They're guesses. I mean, you might poll 600 people, and based on that poll, you're going to predict what a whole state full of people are going to do. It's obviously not. It's a guess, right? And guesses, of course, are. But so today, what we're seeing is polls saying that Trump will beat the other candidates in Iowa, and that what we may see is that Hillary might beat Bernie, but it'll be close, right? Right. So if you're looking at both the Democratic and the Republican caucuses, basically the polls are predicting, not really sure about the Democratic Party, but Trump is basically expected to win in Iowa. Now, his argument, David Brooks, if you ever watch him or listen to him or read him, David Brooks, fairly conservative, considered a columnist, argues basically that the biggest news out of this will be what?
Trump underperforms.
Trump will underperform.
Yeah,
So he's expecting Trump not to win, and his main reason for that is Trump supporters, which are not similar at all to sports supporters, right? That's totally different. Which that was a joke too.
Trump said, "I'm
Laughed
gonna
at
win."
it,
So
you know. But so Trump supporters basically are not likely to vote. So if we're trying to diagram this, as chapter 3 suggests, right, we could use different ways of diagramming arguments. We could have the statements. So statement A supports statement B, and so it goes like this. Right? So maybe that's our argument. This would be the conclusion. This is a premise arguing for this conclusion, and this conclusion is a premise supporting this one. Right? It's pretty easy how that might be diagrammed. So in this particular case, you're saying most of the polls are based on polls of people that are not likely to vote. Only 1/6 of the people will vote, and the typical Trump supporter is not the typical voter. And so the argument is then that Trump will underperform. So the polls are basically based on people that aren't going to vote, and so that Trump is not going to win. But he also points out right at the very beginning that he's always wrong.
He made a career out of it.
He has. He
He's doing
has actually.
something right.
I've even I've even read some of his books. They're good books. My favorite, by the way. In fact, I'll show you this. I think this is really. About 14 minutes, but I think it's really good, so let's listen.
When I got my current job, I was given a good piece of advice, which was to interview 3 politicians every day. And from that much contact with politicians, I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. But what they do have is incredible social skills. When you meet them, they lock into you, they look you in the eye, they invade your personal space, they massage the back of your head. I had dinner with a Republican senator several months ago who kept his hand on my inner thigh throughout the whole meal, squeezing it. This was years ago, I saw Ted Kennedy and Dan Quayle meet in the well of the Senate, and they were friends, and they hugged each other, and they were laughing, and their faces were like this far apart, and they were moving and grinding and moving their arms up and down each other, and I was like, get a room, I don't want to see this. But they have those social skills. Another case, last election cycle, I was following Mitt Romney around New Hampshire. He was campaigning with his 5 perfect
2 election
sons,
cycles
dip,
back.
chip, rip, sip, lip, and dip. And he's going into a diner, and he goes to the diner, introduces himself to a family, and says, what village are you from in New Hampshire? And then he described the home he owned in their village. And then he goes around the room, and then as he's leaving the diner, he first names almost everybody he's just met. I was like, okay, that's social skill. But the paradox is when a lot of these people slip into the policy-making mode, that social awareness vanishes and they start talking about like accountants. So in the course of my career, I've covered a series of failures. We sent economists in the Soviet Union with privatization plans when it broke up, and what they really lacked was social trust. We invaded Iraq with a military oblivious to the cultural and psychological realities. We had